Hi, I'm Tora now. May is Asian Heritage Month. So last year, I was here at the same time too. Last year, when I was invited to talk about my experience being Japanese in Canada, I shared with you a story of a Japanese congregation in Winnipeg. The Japanese members were so happy to see me becoming a minister's wife and part of a respected Caucasian family. Some were in tears. At that time, I realized how hard their lives had been. They had felt looked down upon for being Japanese, so seeing me was a sign of hope and equality and overcoming racism. 45 years later, I still remember that gathering. It helped me become aware of the history of Japanese Canadians in Canada. Coming to BC increased that awareness. I was told that in BC there is more racism. I was not sure. However, traveling in BC, especially the coastal towns and Gulf Islands, people told me, "Oh, we used to have Japanese, hard-working market gardeners or a thriving fishing community. But during the war, they were gone and never came back." Wherever I traveled in BC, there are a history of a Japanese Canadian community before the war. 22,000 people, they simply left? No, they were taken away by their government, and all their assets were confiscated. Fishing boats, houses, market gardens, equipment, furniture, properties. They only could take their belongings to the harsh internment camps. They never came back. They could not come back. All of their properties and boats, market gardens were taken away and sold cheap. They had nothing to come back, nothing come back to. One of internment era survivor, Mary Kitagawa, said, "My grandparents' retirement on their 200-acre on Salt Spring Island was stolen from them in 1942. After 40 years of struggles to build their home, destroying their lives forever." During the Second World War, Japanese Canadians were sent to internment camps by their own government. And being Japanese, they were stoic and silent. Shikata ga nai. Shikata ga nai. It is what it is. We don't always have control over our lives. They endured, and they did not talk about it. However, new generations of Japanese Canadians and other Canadians are finding out the truth of this injustice. Strong racism was behind Japanese Canadians' internment from 1942 to 1949. Imagine, it continued for 4 years even after the Second World War ended. The RCMP and the military had advised that Japanese Canadians to Canada were not a threat and need not to be moved. However, a strong anti-Japanese sentiment in BC pushed the Canadian government into action. Here is a quote from Ian Mackenzie, then a federal cabinet minister from BC. "It is the government's plan to get these people out of BC as fast as possible. It is my personal intention, as long as I remain in public life, to see they never come back here. Let our slogan be for British Columbia: no Japs from the Rockies to the seas." Allen and I were with a group of Victoria Japanese Canadians yesterday when we watched a live stream of Premier John Hogan's announcement on the 80th anniversary of internment. $100 million in Canadian in recognizing of internment history. People there were in tears. Lost properties, years of suffering, but finally, BC government is taking responsibility for past governments' ill treatment to Japanese Canadians. It took 80 years. Some funds will support all the survivors in their final years, but also revising school curriculums so that the new generations will learn what happened and work for tolerance and inclusion. There were many people who helped Japanese Canadians in these hard times, and the United Churches were there for Japanese internment camps. Jesus said, "Love one another as I had loved you." No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Now, if your friends is suddenly taken away because of political racism, what are you going to do?
For all your goodness, I will keep on singing. 10,000 reasons for my heart to name. The sun comes up, a new day's dawning. It's time to sing your song again. And whatever may pass, whatever lies before me, let me still be singing till the evening comes. Let me still be singing till the evening comes. Come to my house. Come to my house. That's what Lydia said to Paul and the others. Now, what would a Greek woman be doing in that age, issuing an invitation to a group of Jewish Christians, men? And the invite, it comes at a major turning point in Paul's ministry. Just a couple of verses earlier we read, at a time when his ministry had stalled, Paul hears a similar invitation. This time it's in the form of a dream or a vision, and he sees a man who says to him, "Come on over to Macedonia and help us." He and the others take this as a sign, and soon they're on their way all the way over to Macedonia. And not long after they arrive in Philippi, they have this second invitation. "Come on to my house," says Lydia. This Greek woman issuing the invitation to some Jewish Christian men. What's going on here? Well, you see on the slide, Istanbul. And the bridges of Istanbul can give us, they can be a sign or a reminder of the significance of this passage. I say that because Istanbul is a great city which actually straddles two continents. On the east, you will find Asia. On the west is Europe. And so if we look at one of the wonderful modern bridges that span the Bosphorus Strait and connects those two continents, those two parts of Istanbul, it might be a symbol for us today, helping us to realize what's going on in this passage. Up until now, Paul has been in the East, in Asia, exclusively, in Turkey and other areas like that. But now, with this invitation to go to Macedonia, which is similar to modern-day Greece, he ventures for the first time stepping on European soil. And not long after that, then he meets Lydia in Philippi, and this Greek woman, she becomes like one of those bridges, welcoming him and the others into her home, welcoming them into her life and learning about their people, about their culture, about their way of being. Now, Lydia, Saint Lydia to many, she was a remarkable person even before this incredible invitation. In a business world that was dominated by men, she was a successful merchant of purple cloth. Now, purple cloth, that was very expensive, very precious. Anyone who wore it, it was a sign of their status. She also apparently was the head of her household. Some have speculated that she was a widow. Maybe, but there's nothing in the text that would suggest that. But what the text does make clear is that she was a God worshiper. She was a seeker. And when she heard Paul's message, she was deeply moved by it. And she then was baptized, becoming the first documented Christian in Europe. That is when she issues the invitation to Paul, Timothy, and Silas. And for the rest of their time in Philippi, they reside in her home. So she always will be remembered for her incredible hospitality that she showed, for her leadership, and for the way that she was a bridge of understanding for Paul and the others. And I imagine that for each one of us, there have been people in our lives who have been like Lydia, maybe several of them. For myself, the person who comes to mind for me is Joan Imai. For only 4 months, Joan and I lived in the same community, Steveston. It was 46 years ago that we first met, this very month. It was at a pivotal time in my own life. I had just come back from a visit to Japan. And I had just become engaged to a young Japanese widow, Megami. And I was to become the father of her 4-year-old daughter. That fall, there would be a wedding in Toronto where I would be finishing my last year at seminary. But first, these 4 months as a student minister at Steveston United Church and with a Japanese Nisei congregation in Vancouver. My supervisor was Joan's husband, Gordon Imai. Gordon was a wonderful man. He was a person of great integrity and compassion, someone of deep faithfulness. Over those 4 months together, Gordon did so much to help prepare me, not just for ministry, but also for a cross-cultural marriage to, well, you know who. And he did extremely well. Indeed, his marriage to Joan was something to be celebrated. Joan Imai, she was the homemaker. And it took place in a home that also was a traditional church manse. And that meant that there resided not only the 4 teenage and young adult Imai children, but also all sorts of visitors coming in and out of that house. And Joan, she welcomed folks with such grace. She was simply amazing. She excelled in that Japanese ideal of hospitality. And it began as she greeted you at the door with her smile. You know, most people, I think, they smile with their mouths. But with Joan, she smiled with her whole face. Immediately, you felt fully welcomed, and you were very much at home in her house. So like Lydia, in a way, Joan and Gordon Imai, they showed this gift of hospitality, welcoming me into their home. And they were bridges for me, bridges who gently introduced me to the Japanese-Canadian experience. I don't know what you did through your teen years. I don't know how you spent those teen years, but hopefully you didn't spend them in an internment camp like Joan and Gordon did. Camp Tashme. Camp Tashme, just beyond hope. Indeed, beyond hope is how the people must have felt. Such crude little buildings, desperate situation for them. That first winter, there wasn't a single bit of insulation in that bitter cold. They wondered what in the world was going on. They were in shock. They had been good, law-abiding citizens, and now this? And yet, the people dug in, they pulled together, and somehow they came through it. Most of them. Most of them. One day, Gordon invited me to join a group of old-timers, the Issei, the first generation. They were going to go on a bus trip to go visit the site where Camp Tashme had been. First time any of them had gone to this area in 30 years or so. I recall as the bus headed out, there was this lively chatter among the people. When we finally got to the site, we got out and we looked at the scattered remains. People walked about. After a moment, one of the men called out, he thought he had found where the baths used to be. Everyone chuckled. On the bus ride back to Steveston, it was very quiet. Too many memories. Too many memories. One pastoral visit I made, I was welcomed so graciously by a couple there. Their home was just a very simple little bungalow, but they were very proud of that home. This was the same home that had been stolen from them during the Second World War. It had been taken from them, they got a pittance for it, but afterwards, after 1949, they came back, and they worked hard, and they saved until they finally could buy the very house that had been taken from them. I would have conversations with the sansei, the third generation, the grandchildren, Issei, Nisei, Sansei. And they were about my age. I was around 24 at the time. And they would tell me how their grandparents were absolutely amazed that they could go to university, that they could get jobs of different professions and so forth. Back in their grandparents' day, the only jobs that racism would allow were things like fishing, market gardening, working in the canneries. That was about it. Joan Imai. Joan Imai, she knew their stories. These were her people. She knew their suffering. She'd been a teenager throughout her teen years living in a camp, an internment camp. And yet not once did I see even a hint of resentment or bitterness. By the grace of God and by her own good soul, she remained grounded. She remained full of grace and kindness. And with her husband, Gordon, she welcomed me into their home, into their lives. And always be amazed that this happened. You see, it was the first time that a student minister had ever gone to those particular churches. And the reason was that things were different this summer. They were different 46 years ago. Because for the previous 2 years, their third child, a 16-year-old girl named Susan, had been battling cancer. And the thought was that a student might benefit from everything that Gordon and Joan could offer, but also that the student might in some way be able to assist them in such a desperate circumstance. Before my first month in Steveston was even over, Susan died. And despite the intense and great grief that they experienced, Joan and Gordon continued to keep inviting me into their home, into their lives. 3 months later, I was gone, off to Toronto for that last year of studies and an autumn wedding. Next summer, however, I came back for a visit in Steveston. We even set up a tent right on the manse lawn. And I was just so delighted that Megan and our daughter could meet these two wonderful people, Joan and Gordon Imai, people who had become to me like my favorite uncle and aunt. Yesterday, when we heard the announcement from the Premier, and afterwards, as the group of Japanese Canadians and their friends started to disperse, Megami and I decided to go to Gorge Park. You know how in 1907 there was a Japanese tea house there and a Japanese garden, one of the first in North America? And immediately it was such a success that the locals and visitors alike would all come to it. And probably you know the news that they've been renewing and restoring that garden. And there's this striking pavilion in a Japanese style that is going to be dedicated next month. And we went, and this renewed garden, it is so beautiful and so tranquil. And I thought, what a wonderful way not only to remember and honor the past, what a wonderful way to lift up our hope for the future. And as Megami and I slowly strolled through the garden, I could not help think of Joan and Gordon and how delighted they would be. Amen.